Hey guys, Phil Harris here, and first things first, please do not ask about my hair. In fact, for the rest of this video, don't even look at the hair, okay? So, in this week's video, I wanted to run you through how I did the remix of the track, Not So Bad. And instead of just jumping in and showing you these kind of technical things, I want to actually make this video for people who maybe have never made a track before but love house music. And there's certain things I'm going to show you which may kind of like open up your eyes to how easy it can actually be to make tracks like this. So let's get straight into it. Boof. Now, just before we get into this video, I did want to say, if you are interested in making your own dance music, but you have no idea where to start, then don't worry. I'm currently doing some free live training on my website at edmcoaching.com. There'll be a link underneath this video. You can go through, register your spot for the free live training, jump on one of the training sessions, and I'll teach you everything you need to know about creating your own incredible dance music just like this. Okay guys, so let's just get straight into it. So as I mentioned, I want to try and break this track down in a way for somebody who maybe has never made music before can kind of begin to get their head around how they could potentially go ahead and put a track like this together. So the first thing you want to decide is what you want your track to sound like, which the best thing you can do is go and find a ton of tracks that you like and say, I'm going to make this track sound like this track here. So what I did was I went and listened to loads of tracks I liked that are kind of big room, Melbourne house, and I knew that all of those tracks had big drops. So I knew that I was going to have to add a big drop into this track if I was going to make a remix of it. So that's where I always start, at the drop, because that's the main bit. That's the bit that I want the drop to be good. It's kind of like the rest of the track revolves around the drop, in my opinion. Now what's great is once you've built up a drop, you can use elements of the drop to use all over the shop and the rest of the song. So, for example, my drop has got this lead in it. It sounds like this. And in the drop, it sounds like this. Now, I'm going to go into the drop in more detail in a second, but what's great is once I had the drop, it meant on the breakdown, I could use elements, like I could use this lead on the breakdown. So as you can listen now, what happens is just after the singing finishes, at the beginning of the breakdown, I just bring in this lead. Have a listen. That's basically the exact same lead as I use in the drop. And if you were to go and listen to basically any Martin Garrix track or any big room house track out there, the exact same thing happens. The build up to the drop is basically the exact same lead as what the lead that's in the actual drop. Now, what that's kind of psychologically doing is it's preparing everybody for the melody that's going to hit in the drop. So you hear it in the breakdown, and then as it builds and builds, what usually happens is people take the melody, which is the lead sound that I just played you then, and they repeat a small section of it, almost like it's on a shorter loop. Then it gets shorter and shorter, which kind of builds tension in a track, which is exactly what I did. So after that lead came in, it then went into the last bit of the build where the snare drums go really quick and the white noise comes up, and that sound basically loops and loops quicker and quicker. Have a listen. So, as you can see, what I'm trying to explain to you here is the great thing about starting with the drop is when you want to pad out the rest of the song and build up the rest of the song, you're basically taking a lot of the elements that are already in the drop and moving them around. So taking the leads and moving them over there, chopping it up to make the build up, layering some other instruments on top of it. And even when it comes to things like intros and outros, I'm using the kick drum from the drop. And even after the drop on the second breakdown, I use this like really nice kind of pad effect here, which is actually the exact same melody from the drop again. Listen to it by itself first. It's the exact same melody as this, except with a different instrument. But if you listen to it in context of the song, So as you can see, this is why I always say to people, start with the drop, because once you've got the drop, you can build up the rest of the track around it using elements from the drop. So with that being said, let me run through where I started, which is the drop and all the elements. So the first thing you want to think about when you're building a drop is the drums, then the bass, so you've got the drum and bass together. Then you want to think about the melody. Now, a lot of people would start with the melody, but I always like to have the kick and bass going while I play around with melodies on top, because I feel like I can hear it all in context. Once you've got the melody in place, you can work with things like percussion, which is hi-hats and claps and stuff like that. And once I've got the basis of a drop together, then I will think about tying the original song back into the drop so it's cohesive with the song that I'm currently remixing. And then finally, I think about little elements on top like white noise and stuff like that. So let me go through each of these sections now and explain it in a little bit more detail. So the first things first, which I said, was the drums. So the drum I knew I was going to have was just a 4 on the floor, which basically means a kick drum on every quarter note. Like most dance music, sounds like this. Then I wanted to think about the bass, and I thought, well, I want to keep this really simple, because with most drops, the kick and bass are just kind of a lot of energy. You don't really have to think too much about them. So I decided that I wanted my bass to be an offbeat bass, which means the kick hits, then the bass hits, then the kick hits, then the bass hits. So it creates this kind of bounce to it. Have a listen to the two together. So I have my kick and my bass put together. The next thing which I say to always think about then is the melody. What's actually going on top? And I knew I wanted some kind of festival sound, and I knew I wanted it to sound quite bouncy. So I went to my leads here and I just got one lead sound to start and just played around using my keyboard with different kind of melodies. So this is what it sounds like. Okay, so I was just playing around with that. Now, in terms of how I wrote that, I was literally just playing around with different notes. I have something called an Ableton push that puts everything in key, so I was just like playing around with what I thought sounded good. And in all honesty, that took the longest time coming out with a melody, because that was the thing I knew everything was going to be based around. Now, without going into too much detail or making it sound too complicated, the next thing I wanted was that sound to sound a lot bigger than it did with just one sound. So I went and I found a ton of different sounds that basically made it sound wider and bigger. So some of the other lead sounds I found were just a regular sawtooth, which was basically gave it a bit more body. It sounds like this. I had a much wider sound that sounded like this. So it was a bit kind of wider and had a lot more white noise. It was kind of a higher frequency. And then I also wanted a lead that had more of a lower frequency going on that sounded like this. Now when you put all of those sounds together, it creates this really kind of quite big sound. Now the other thing which you always want to do is this thing called sidechain. Now essentially what sidechaining is every time the kick hits, you get all your other instruments to drop out of the way and come back up. And it creates this kind of breathing effect. In the same way the kick happened and then the bass happened, you want the same thing happening with all your other instruments. They're kind of ducking out the way when the kick hits and then coming back up again. So what you can see here is a plugin called Volume Shaper, which basically tells the volume to dip when the kick hits and come back up. So this is the sound without Volume Shaper. And this is with it. Now it'll make a lot more sense if I play it with the kick drum at the top. So let me just solo that out. And you'll hear now, if I take it off and play it, you'll hear that the lead and the kick drum are just sitting on top of each other. Whereas as soon as I turn it on, what happens is the lead gets out of the way of the kick drum and drops. Listen. Which creates this kind of breathing effect. Now at that point I have my kick, my bass and my melodies, which is typically the main thing that comes in just when the drop starts happening. So it sounds a little bit like this. And I decided that what I wanted to introduce next was some percussion. Percussion is great for adding more energy to the drop. Now, because it adds more energy to the drop, you don't want to bring it in straight away, because as the drop goes on, you want the energy to build a little bit. So for the first 4 bars, usually what typically happens is you just have the kick, the bass, and the melody. But after on the second 4 bars, you'll then start bringing in some percussion. So in my case, I decided to bring in a hi-hat and a clap. So what typically happens with hi-hats is, like the bass, it happens between every kick drum. So if I should just play the hi-hat and the kick drum together, you'd hear what I'm talking about. And I also wanted to bring in a clap. Now with claps, typically they happen on every other kick drum. So together they all sound a bit like this. Which is basically all that happened on the second 4 bars of my drop. So if you have a listen, you'll hear the hi-hats and the clap come in. Now, the only other bit of percussion that I really added in was some rides at the end, which are basically kind of crashy sounds. They sound a bit like this by themselves. But that kind of high-pitched noise can be used to add a bit more energy. So have a quick listen to them in the mix. Perfect, so at this point we basically have a really cool drop. We've got kick, bass, melody, and some percussion. Now the next thing you guys should always think about at this point is how to bring in the original song into the drop at some point. So what I know is from drops, they usually have a little vocal sample halfway through. And I decided I wanted my vocal sample to be taken from the lyrics of the song. So I went and chopped out this little section here. I can't see at all. So if we were to listen to that in context, it sounds a little bit like this. But I decided I wanted to add something a bit more interesting to this vocal. So what I did was I put an effect on it, which caused it to kind of stutter towards the end. So if you have a listen to it now, the second half, it goes very stuttery. Have a listen. Which I just thought was a really cool effect, and this is just a plugin called Effectrix, and all you do is basically just draw a line over where you want it to stutter. So that's it. So now if you listen to it in the context of the mix. Okay, so that's how I decided to bring in the main bit of the song into the drop so it was all coherent. The final thing you want to think about when you're building up a really cool drop is just additional little sound effects that can make your drop sound more professional. So one of the things I did was just added in a few drum sounds, and these are pre-made drum sounds from sample packs. So I've got one here that sounds a little bit like this. In context of the mix, it sounds like this. And there's another one down here that sounds a little bit like this. In context of the mix. So those were drum sounds, and then if I come right down to the bottom, I've got a whole section down here called noise. Now this is really interesting. One of the first things that typically happens when the drop hits is there's quite a lot of kind of white noise. It sounds a bit like when you're actually watching a professional DJ live and the gas canisters go off just as the drop hits. So I have this white noise that sounds a little bit like this. In context of the mix, it sounds a little bit like this. But there's another type of white noise that I've added in, which I think you guys will think is really cool. They're just crowd noises. So the first crowd noise sounds a little bit like this. It sounds like a huge crowd of people are screaming, which is exactly what it is. And I've also got another one here that sounds like this. So if I put the two together, it sounds like this. Mixed with the white noise. And what this does is it kind of creates this effect that people are going absolutely crazy when the drop hits, which, whether you're aware of it or not, will create a lot of energy in the drop. So when the drop hits, what you probably may not have realized you were listening to is thousands of people are screaming. Let's have a listen to it. So the final tip I wanted to give you in building up a really cool drop is the second half of the drop. So typically there's 16 bars to a kind of EDM drop. And in the second 8 bars, you want to try and build the energy even more rather than just repeating the first half of the drop. So one way you can do this is to add in a couple of like whoops and stuff like that, which I know sounds silly, but honestly, it adds so much energy. So I added in this sound here. Now listen to it in with the mix. You'll notice that it really adds a bit more hype. So that was one of the things I started to add in. Now I didn't add it in all the time, so there were certain places where I just took it away where I felt like I couldn't even really hear it, so I just removed it. And the other thing which I wanted to do was add in a bit of a riser effect, almost a signal that it was rising to get to the end of the drop, if that makes any sense. So I just went and got this riser sound, again from a sample pack. Sounds a bit like this. And to add a little bit more energy to it, what I did was I then kind of added this effect that created a bit of a stutter on it. Again, have a listen. And I was just using this thing called an LFO tool, which just puts a bit of a stutter on it like that. And again, in context to the track, it sounds like this. So once you have your drop all sorted, all you need to then do is think about how you can take elements from your drop and build it into the rest of the track, which is really quite straightforward. So for example, if I was to go and get my breakdown and build up, as we already know, all I'm doing is playing the main melody from the drop. I've also got some festival claps playing at the top, which basically just sounds like huge groups of people are clapping. Have a listen. And if I go right down to the bottom, you'll hear I've also got more audience screaming and stuff. So the beginning of the breakdown sounds like this. And then when it gets into the build, again, very simple elements go into the build. So I've got some snare drums that get quicker and quicker. I've got the melody, which is getting quicker and quicker as well. So it sounds like this. And then here, which is kind of pitching up over time. I've also taken some vocals and I've chopped them up and I've made them quicker over time as well. So it sounds like this. And what happens with this vocal is it actually gets pitched up as well. I'll show you how to pitch it up now. So I've got two things going on there. I've got a vocal that's kind of being filtered down and then filtered back up. Watch this here. Like that, and if I click in this clip here and open it up, you'll see that it's just pitched up over time, which is what causes it to rise. And then again, if I just go down into the white noise, all I've got is these two risers here. So the one sounds like this, and the other sounds like this. And you put those like 4 elements together and you get a build that sounds like this. And the rest of the track was really very simple. All I did for the main bit is I let the vocals and the drum do most of the work here. So there you go, guys. Hopefully what this video has taught you is how to think about doing remixes, especially if you want to start doing big room house remixes that have big drops like this. All you've got to think about is what do you want your drop to sound like following the steps I gave you, and then take elements of your drop and build it into the rest of the track. And as long as you do that, you should be able to go out there and remix almost any track you want using these techniques. So there you go, guys. Hopefully you've learned something new from this video. If you have, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. I love reading all my comments, so make sure you leave one. As I said at the beginning of this video, if you are interested in making dance music just like this, but you feel like you just don't know enough, or you're disappointed with the music you're currently making, I'm currently doing free live training sessions at my website at edmcoaching.com. There'll be a link directly below this video. You can go and register your spot for the next free live training session. Finally, I just wanted to say, if you like these kind of videos and you want to see more like them, then make sure you subscribe to my channel by hitting this button here. If you want to go and check out that free live training, hit that button down there. And finally, if you just want to go and watch this track I made again, now you know how I've made it, hit this button below. I'll see you guys in next week's video. Ciao! Boof.